Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin the proceedings, and on behalf of all those present, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I would also like to pay respect to elders past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. This session will now be recorded. We will record audio, screen share, and our presenters. We will not be recording any video input or audio from you. Welcome to all UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Amy Ma, and I'm the Communications Officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute, ACRI, at the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese study centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of these countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you wanted to explore more about the Australia-China relationship, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Today, we are here to discuss UTS ACRI's newly released report, COVID-19 and the Australia-China Relationship's Zombie Economic Idea, authored by Professor James Lawrenson, Director of UTS ACRI, and Michael Zhou, UTS ACRI's Project and Research Officer. Their report examines Australia's trade exposure to China, what is driving this exposure, and whether this level of exposure serves Australia's national interests. The report also looks at the prospects for greater diversification of Australia's economic relationships in the near future. These issues are increasingly the subject of scrutiny and debate, driven especially to the fore by the COVID-19 pandemic. Lead author James Lawrenson will be giving a presentation of the report's key findings, and he'll be joining Rowan Callick for an in-conversation style discussion. Audience questions are welcome at the end. Now, a little bit about the speakers. Professor James Lawrenson's academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including China Economic Review and China Economic Journal. He also provides regular commentary on contemporary developments in China's economy and the Australia-China economic relationship in such publications as the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and South China Morning Post, amongst many others. Rowan Callick is an author, columnist, and UTS ACRI Advisory Board member who has worked for almost 20 years for the Australian Financial Review, finally as Asia Pacific editor. He has also worked for the Australian, twice serving as China correspondent in Beijing, and also as Asia Pacific editor. He continues to write regularly for the newspaper. Rowan is a board member of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, and author of 3 books published in both English and Chinese, including Party Time, Who Runs China and How. Now, I'd like to welcome Professor James Lawrenson to give an outline of the findings of UTS ACRI's latest report.
Thanks so much, Amy. Okay, let's see if we can get past the first hurdle of sharing my screen. Okay, thanks very much for joining us, everyone. Look, I've got to say, this is perfect timing, I think, for this report to be coming out. The title is COVID-19 and the Australia-China Relationships, Zombie Economic Idea. It's a 10,000 word report. I'm very tempted to go into the details of the data tables and the case studies, but I'm going to resist because I've promised Rowan and Amy that I'll be sticking to a 15-minute timetable, and that'll allow lots of time for questions and answers afterwards. We do want this to be as interactive as possible, and so as I'm talking and as Rowan and I are chatting afterwards, after that, feel free to pose your questions. You can do so by clicking on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Well, first of all, a quick explanation of the report's title, Zombie Economics. A zombie economic idea is an idea that's couched in economic language and terminology, but in fact is one that doesn't stack up against the facts and the evidence. In this report, what we do is we highlight a zombie economic idea of the Australia-China economic relationship. That idea is that at an aggregate level, at a macroeconomic level, the Australian economy is too dependent on China. How many times have you heard that? Or there's a microeconomic version, a business level version that says companies that have a heavy exposure to China are somehow irresponsible in their risk management strategies. And this zombie economic idea has exploded since COVID-19 started. There's been news stories on the front pages of Australian newspapers over the last few months describing Australian companies that are suffering as their Chinese market hit rocky times or their supply chains were disrupted. In turn, these news stories have generated an upswing of commentary that it is now clearly time, they say, that Australia diversified away from China. And not just diversified in the sense of growing other markets, but it's time for the Australian government to step up and force a diversification in trade ties away from China. That is, let's be clear, that is force a decoupling of the Australian and Chinese economies. These commentaries are coming predominantly from those who view the world through a national security lens, although not exclusively. Here's one example coming from Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who makes his view very plain. This is just from a week ago in The Australian. A view is hardening, it's certainly hardening in Peter Jennings' mind, that economic dependence on China is dangerous and steps must be taken, right? This is very clear. Steps must be taken to reduce that dependence. What is also fascinating to me, and we've seen this particularly in the last week, is the Australian conversation around decoupling from China being an echo of the discussion that the US has been having in recent years. Here's a piece in the Wall Street Journal just a week ago from Paula Dobriansky, who was a foreign policy specialist in the George W. Bush administration. And she advocates that Washington should be working with Australia to set up new supply chains, to create an international economic order that is less dependent on China. And moreover, she says that the quadrilateral security dialogue, is an optimal venue for these discussions to take place. And just this morning, I saw another example of this type of commentary published on ASPI's The Strategist from Charles Idle from the United States Studies Center, again, advocating this idea that democracies work together to secure supply chains and reduce dependence on China. Look, it's not hard to see why the average Australian on the street might come to think that the Australian economy is too dependent on China. Take a look at these numbers. They're pretty stark. Two-way trade with China now totals $235 billion. In second is daylight, and in third place is Japan with just $88 billion. So it's no surprise that we have this common view, although I'll explain why I think it's a zombie view, a zombie idea soon, that the Australian economy is too dependent on China. Let me run through a few very high-level arguments about why, in fact, this is a zombie economic idea. Look, I think the first thing these commentaries miss is that there are national interest benefits from engaging with China, as well as the fact that Australian businesses are not stupid. And in fact, they and the Australian government take active steps to mitigate these risks. There is a basic point of conceit in the argument that businesses are irresponsible in their risk management. After all, don't forget, it is the business owners themselves that have their own money on the line if things go wrong. So businesses are very incentivized to be well informed about both the risks and the opportunities associated with China engagement. When you run through the list of Australia's major exports to China, iron ore, coal, LNG, wine, beef, education, tourism, it's not at all clear to me which of those sectors that the Australian government, is somehow better informed about when it comes to the risk-return equation. I mean, we could just think about universities, my own sector, as being a classic case of a sector that gets singled out as being irresponsible in their China engagement. And yet, what is the benefits that China engagement has brought the national interest? Australia has 0.3% of the world's population, but it has 7% of the global top 100 universities? Well, there's a few reasons behind that, but a major one is that the Australian University has set about exporting and internationalisation, with China leading that charge. So if we don't want universities engaging with China to the extent that they are now, let's just be clear about the cost of that. We won't be having 7 Australian universities in the top 100. In other words, Australia won't be at the global forefront of knowledge creation. That's a pretty serious cost. Second point, this seems to be a hard one for some people to accept. Business interests are an important part of the national interest. They're not a contradiction. Businesses seeking profit is what generates jobs in this country and also provides revenue for the Australian government to in turn provide services. Now, clearly, business interests are not the same as the national interest. The national interest is broader. It encompasses national security and the strategic outlook. So, of course, and we say this very clearly in the report, Australian businesses need to be alive to the risks, for example, that the Australian government quite rightly will sometimes take steps to preserve Australian sovereignty and our freedom of action. We might think of the decision to ban the Chinese company Huawei from the country's 5G rollout as an example. And that could provoke retaliation from China. Clearly, if you've got a business model exposed to China, that's a relevant risk you need to be taking into account. But the argument is that forcing Australian businesses to reduce or cut trade ties with China, as opposed to simply ensuring they're better informed about those risks, that's neither a logical nor a proportionate response to this risk. I thought last week, Dennis Richardson got it absolutely right. Of course, our former Secretary of Defence. He was invited to comment on Twiggy Forrest's and Kerry Stokes's controversial comments that Canberra should moderate its tone towards China relations. And he said, well, I think Mr. Forrest does a superb job with his business interests. And here's the key point, and that serves Australia's interests. So let's get that clear. These are not in contradiction, but I don't think people look to him in terms of direction in respect of foreign policy. Exactly right. Third observation, at a national level, saying that Australia is too dependent on China has something very implicit in it. And it's an implicit assumption that we can reduce our dependence on China by switching to an alternative. That is, we can become less dependent on China by being more dependent on India, Indonesia, perhaps traditional partners like the US and Japan as well. But here's the thing. The assumption's wrong. For many Australian goods and services, there is simply no viable alternative to China. And demonstrating that point in a devastating way, I think, is this data on the screen now. If you look at Australia's export data over the last decade, you'll see that the annual value has jumped by $180 billion. Well, I don't think anyone's brave enough to suggest that's anything other than in Australia's national interest. But it's only been possible because of one country, China, which has accounted for 60% of the jump. Other Indo-Pacific economies, including the ones most frequently touted as offering diversification potential from China, have hardly registered. So what this means is that the only trade diversification strategy that makes any sense for Australia is a China and one. That is, we sell as much as we can to China and we try and build other export markets as well. The idea that a China or strategy is optimal when there is no alternative is a recipe for damaging Australia's national interest. Okay, let me now skip to imports and make 2 quick observations here. I'm pretty alarmed, to be frank, about how amateurish some of the commentary around Australia's exposure to China on the import side of things is. Managing supply chain risks is certainly of importance to Australia's national interest, but it is a whole lot more complex than simply importing more goods from countries other than China. This is because Australia's supply chains are connected to global value chains, with imports from China featuring imports from a host of other countries, such as the United States, Japan, and India. In other words, when we import a good from China, we are in fact importing goods from all these other countries as well. And similarly, goods that we import from the United States and India are going to have Chinese inputs embedded in them. So the idea that you can just import fewer final goods from China and that'll somehow solve your supply chain risks is a gross simplification and a pretty inadequate approach to mitigating these risks. Here's another thing. These supply chain decisions, the geographical distribution of these supply chains in global value chains, are made by multinational companies that are beyond the reach of Australian policymakers. So the idea that the Department of Defence or the Department of Health in Canberra has the levers to affect these supply chains, again, is very, very simplistic. There's genuine discussions to be had around mitigating supply chain risks, and we make that clear in the report. But the idea that simply importing fewer final goods from China is an effective risk mitigation strategy, let alone a cost-effective one, is disastrously simplistic. Final point. Again, on imports and supply chains. Some of the claims that I've been reading about the risks in Australia's supply chains are disturbing because they seem to be based on misinformation. Let's just call it in plain terms. I remember in particular that there was one from Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of ACRI a few weeks ago, where he said a stronger national security perspective had to be brought to Australia's supply chains, and he rattled off a list of goods. One of those goods was food. Well, that's curious because a recent report just a couple of months ago by the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resources Economics concluded that Australia is in fact one of the most food secure countries in the world. We don't have a food security problem. In fact, Australia only imports 11% of the food we consume, where 70%, more than half of the agricultural production we produce is actually surplus to domestic needs. And so we sell it overseas. Here's another one that disturbs me. I've read, and in the report, we cite numerous commentaries of Australia's supply chains for medicines and pharmaceutical products being vulnerable because they're too dependent on China. Well, I wonder how many of those commentators actually went to the trade data to see how significant China was in our supply chains for medicines. We did, and we found that only 2% of Australia's medicines and pharmaceutical imports in 2019 came from China. 47% came from the European Union, 21% came from the United States, a greater proportion came from India as well. So if you're going to diversify away from China, you're talking about going from 2 to 1%. I'm not sure that's going to make a significant difference. Now, a more sophisticated commentary might say, well, yes, but some of the imports from the European Union include inputs, active pharmaceutical ingredients that China supplies. True, which makes the point that simply switching from China to India isn't going to carve China out of your supply chains. And in any case, the companies that are making these geographical location decisions are in fact not Chinese companies. They are giant United States and European pharmaceutical companies. So again, this idea that the Department of Health, let alone the Department of Defence in Canberra, can improve Australia's supply chain resilience for medicines and pharmaceutical products is very much misplaced. So I'll finish on this one. My 15 minutes is up. The report doesn't suggest in any way that there's not important discussions to be had around managing the risks associated with Australia's international economic exposure. But the argument that somehow the national interest is best served by the government forcing a diversification in trade ties away from China, a decoupling of the Australian and Chinese economies, mostly reflects a zombie economic idea. That is an economic idea that deserves to be laid to rest once and for all. Okay, let me stop sharing, and then I look forward to having a chat with my colleague, Rowan Callick. Rowan, I think I'm back.
Thanks very much, James. And Congratulations on providing us with Michael Joe on such a level-headed report on this hugely important issue. The challenge provided by the People's Republic of China is too great to consider in an undifferentiated way. Starting with economic engagement, which along with our interpersonal links is Australia's most important connection, makes sense. It's where our interests are especially clearly engaged. And as you've made clear, if we choose to start detaching ourselves from our biggest trading partner, a third of exports, a quarter of imports, we need to ask what we stand to gain and lose, whether there are viable alternatives, what mechanism might achieve this. The challenge is amplified because now our values are also clearly being enlisted, elevated alongside interests as factors in determining our international relations, partly at least due to the energy with which Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping has driven his socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. A new era sought not only within China, but increasingly globally too. This values-laden reboot is being answered by Trump's trade war, which perhaps is soon going to be revived, we'll see, by Europe's declaring China a strategic competitor, and by growing anxiety, as you said, in Australia too. Yesterday, main tabloid newspaper here in Melbourne quoted AFL legend Mick Malthouse as urging an end even to the annual footy games in Shanghai. I'm not anti-Chinese, he said. Am I anti-Chinese government? Yes, I am. I don't think we should be selling our soul to a regime that clearly has different values than we do, close quote. Such strong remarks set me to wondering, what might happen if shareholders, consumers, and funds start applying pressure to boards and managements to shift business steadily away from the PRC, perhaps in a similar way to the sentiment that's driven companies to adjust their strategies to encompass concerns about climate change, for which many Australians have indeed been willing to pay a price. Do you think that's a possibility, and how might that manifest, James?
Yeah, I think it is a possibility, Rowan, and no one is walking away from this idea that China under Xi Jinping, the values that regime espouses are not consistent with Australian values. So the short answer to your question, Rowan, is that I have no problem with that. My point is there you've got a business that are factoring into account all its opportunities and risks, and they're coming up with their own decisions. Now, if that includes the risk of alienating their own domestic customers, well, I think that's entirely legitimate. I think, though, Rowan, that's exactly what companies do now. You know, there's been some naivety, I think, in the way some commentators view businesses. This idea that they're blind to things like the risk of economic coercion from coming from China. Businesses already evaluate a diverse range of risks, including political risks. So this is not something that they're blind to.
Thanks, James. I'd like to ask about investment, which doesn't feature very strongly, but that's no surprise since Australia hasn't really, since the faded days of trying to fosterize China, I can still remember those sad days, exciting days maybe. We haven't really invested there. In fact, we've invested less there than we have in Papua New Guinea. Do you feel that this makes a difference to the perspective of Australian companies, perhaps compared with other countries around the world, Germany, America, Japan, Korea, so on, perhaps diminishing their understanding of how things are changing there? It's interesting to note that I think that the great Asian value chains, whose significance you rightly stress in the report, have recently been shifting their relative weightings from the PRC in response to rising costs in China, to Trump's trade war, and to incentives provided by other Asian economies like Japan and Taiwan, and other factors. While China attractive elements such as its clusters around special sectors continue to give it a big comparative advantage. So do you think we have a different kind of, the views we hear from business and the perspective is a bit different because we don't actually have the money invested there. We're not on the ground.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct, Rowan. And look, our Prime Minister is actually very open about this. I remember particularly when he was in America last year on a state visit, where he made the comment that Australia looks at the China relationship through a different lens. And he said it's important that we're just upfront about that. It's also true that issues around intellectual property right theft, for example, now they're a very legitimate concern for the Americans and for the Europeans as well. Now, that issue just doesn't touch Australia to the same extent that it does those other places because the types of trade we're engaged in are different. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with, for example, the Australian government informing Australian business, making sure they are aware of the real shifts. I mean, I've noticed this in academia as well, of the real shifts that have occurred in China under President Xi Jinping. At the same time, it's the Australian government's job to stand up for Australian interests, whatever those interests may be.
And I completely agree with the report's finding that Australian businesses need to factor Chinese pressure into their risk management, as you've stressed in your remarks. How, including by taking careful note of reports such as yours, do you think they can best set about doing this? It's not easy, is it? In the past, as we've seen from some leading business figures, they've tended to default to telling Canberra to de-risk on their behalf by changing its tune. But given the degree of bipartisanship on such issues, I don't think that's going to work. And indeed, it would seem to me more counter-effective, seem more counter-effective in diminishing domestic trust in business leadership. It's not adequate to presume that if we stick to making money, the relationship will remain in good order. Because in today's China, politics is definitely upstream of economics, and that's something over which we have very little control, and of which Chinese people have very little control, frankly. Any thoughts on how we might factor in risk better, given, of course, that often events can emerge from left field, way beyond any corporate imaginings. We saw that most clearly to me with the loss due to the THAAD anti-missile deployment of almost the entire $10 billion investment that Lotte, a huge Korean chaebol, had built up painstakingly in China. It lost its investment really in the wash up of that deployment. I guess, however smart you might have been, a member of the family that management that owned Lotte, would have been hard to predict that, wouldn't it? But of course, the risk is bigger because it's invested in China. Right. I guess it's easier to switch trade, sales, or supply.
Yeah, Rowan, so one of the things I often hear about businesses, particularly from national security commentators, that they say the Australian government is aware of risks that businesses are not. So as I said before in my introductory remarks, just temper that with a bit of the self-interest that businesses faces. So it's their money on the line. So they do have a very important incentive to be well aware of the risks across the whole scope that business faces. That said, it is certainly true. For example, the Australian government runs the national security apparatus, not businesses. And so there's important ways that a dialogue can happen between those two groups. I mean, I just think about my own sector, universities last year. So for a long time, universities have been accused, particularly by national security commentators, of being naive in their engagement with China. Universities are just not up to speed with all the risks, the foreign interference risks that China poses to them. Well, fair enough. So what did we do last year? What you saw happen was the university sector and the government sector actually sat down together. The government shared with the university sector their concerns. And what came out of it? Well, it was a series of best practice guidelines to guard against foreign interference in Australia's university sector. Now, I can tell you, I work in the university sector. We felt the exercise was a very helpful and productive one. And as far as I know, the government felt the same way. So there's an example of how businesses, I mean, that can be rolled out to other sectors as well. You don't need to tell, you don't need the Australian government to tell universities they've got to stop educating Chinese students, or they can't undertake research collaboration, but you make sure the universities are fully informed of the risks.
And the notion of decoupling, which is a word we tend not to use so much, but you hear about it in the American debate, which you'd referred to. The notion of decoupling does seem to be spreading, though, a bit beyond the White House these days. And China itself has made its Made in China 2025 strategy, which is aimed at boosting its tech self-reliance. It spends more these days on importing semiconductors than it does oil, in fact. And its China Standards 2035 strategy aims to ensure that that China competes, for instance, in the templates used in installing 5G networks and its successors with Western rivals. Yet at the human level, life and relationships tend to go often as usual, despite the remarks of the Chinese ambassador here that Australian wine and beef may stick in the throats of Chinese consumers. My own observation is that they go down quite well, and that many ordinary Chinese people tend to discount such political rhetoric, as they've learned to do for generations, and they quietly concede COVID lockdown, in part because China itself has been in partial lockdown for the 70 years of the PRC. And they will keep coming, I think, to study and holiday here, unless prevented by exit controls, because they like to do so. It's absolutely crucial for this reason that Australians learn, as I can see that we are starting to do, to differentiate between the Chinese party state and Chinese people, which is something that those in power in Beijing try to prevent us doing. So, and our 1 million+ Australians born in the PRC will keep us connected there, come what may. So I don't know if you share my optimism in terms of what happens at the political level, that on that personal level, quite importantly for your sector and for tourism, things are probably going to keep going.
Well, we don't want to turn this into an optimism fest, Rowan, but I do share your optimism for the simple reason that the data backs it up. We've heard comments hinting at Chinese economic coercion directed at Australia before. I mean, I think particularly in 2008, there were reports, and I'm not discounting these reports, by the way, of Australian wine and beef being held up at Chinese ports. You will remember the Chinese embassy in Canberra issuing a safety warning to Chinese students and tourists here. Many commentators interpreted that as a threat directed at Australia. Well, what was the outcome? And I'm not suggesting we should dismiss that threat, but what was the outcome of it? Well, come the end of 2019, the numbers of beef, wine students and tourists those exports to China were at record highs. So I think that points to the reality that Chinese consumers, look, no one's saying that Chinese state media has no impact on the formation of their views, but the idea that they're sitting around reading the People's Daily and the Global Times as their main source of information, I mean, that's not accurate. And thank goodness it's not, because it means they will default to those people-to-people connections that you're talking about, and those essentially remain strong.
Thanks, James. And how do you think that the boards of Australian companies, which to my mind, bizarrely, almost entirely lack directors with direct experience of working and living in Asia, generally, let alone China, will respond to the slowing of economies in the region post-COVID, and especially that of China, laden with debt and with a return to privileging state ownership and with party control, even of privately owned firms, somewhat complicating the kind of reforms that people are looking for in order to get China growing again. A lot has in the past been pinned or has been riding on the back of the fastest growing economy or economies, looking at raw GDP growth figures. But that's unlikely to be such a viable strategy now, I think, like I suggest. So being better informed about our region, targeting markets more narrowly, might be among the capacities that firms need. Of course, including in China, it's many markets. How do you think our boards might better respond to this change? It's going to look different after COVID, isn't it?
Yeah, it will look different, Rowan. One important point I think we mentioned in the report that is related to this idea is there's no doubt that Australian exports to China are going to take a hit because, as you said, the growth, I mean, we saw the International Monetary Fund revise Chinese GDP growth down from 6% to 1.2% this year. Well, that's a savage cut. I guess the question I would add, though, and this is one for those who are pushing a forced diversification, is which alternative market would we be better off exposed to? I mean, seriously, God help Canada. They've got 75% of their exports, right? We've got 1/3 of our exports going to China. Canada's got 75% of its exports going to the United States, which is expected to shrink, not slow, shrink by 5.9% this year. Or good luck to the motherland, the mother country, England. 45% of its exports going to the EU, expected to shrink by 7.5%. So look, no one's suggesting that this is going to be an easy year, but if you're going to pick a major economy to expose to, China isn't a bad one. It is true, another thing our report does is that we look at the diversification in Australia's exports to the region. And we actually find now that our exports to China are more diversified in terms of the number of products and services being exported than they are to traditional trading partners like Japan. And they're way more diversified than to emerging partners like India. So I am quietly confident that as these Australian companies in the non-resources sectors are having success in China, that we will build a cohort of more informed business leaders here.
Thank you. In the past, for instance, after the global financial crisis in 2009 and 10, our markets celebrated each new billion kwai that the Chinese government put into stimulating the economy. But of course, now we've seen that, and the people who are managing China's economy know this very well, that there's been a reduced return in terms of productivity for each kwai that you put in. And you can't just keep loading debt up, and that there's going to be a lot of wasted capital. Some people say that 1/4 of urban apartments are unoccupied, for example. So there's going to be limits, and yet we seem to sort of leap up and down with joy about this build-up in debt in China, which may, in the long run, not be the best thing for China itself, let alone for us in terms of sustainability. Do you think we're going to see a repeat of that this time?
Well, what I can tell you, Rowan, and this is fascinating to me, even as an economist, someone who specialises in the Australia-China relationship, is that if you look at the first 3 months of trade data for this year, uh, it's quite staggering because in US dollar terms, the value of Chinese imports from Australia in the first 3 months was actually up 3% on the same period in previous years. Now, there's all sorts of qualifications around that. It's mostly minerals and, agriculture's obviously taken a hit, services has taken a hit. But I think it does point to the fact that there are very, very deep complementarities in this relationship, which mean that the trade ties are far more resilient than we might expect.
Yeah.
Now, getting back to macroeconomic hard landings in China, I mean, it's staggering that China hasn't really had one yet. So we shouldn't win it. I want to be one of these people who go on record forecasting a Chinese economic hard landing, because of course it's going to happen. And if it happens in 10 years' time, well, at least I'll be able to say, well, that podcast or that webinar I did with Rowan Kallick back in 2020, I called it then. But look, we come back to fundamentals, right? And if you look at the Australian government's 2017 foreign policy white paper, the standout figure in that white paper was one showing the increase in purchasing power in Australia's region out to 2030. Here's what it said. It said that China would add more new purchasing power than the United States, Japan, India and Indonesia combined. So no, we can't take this for granted. It may go off the rails, but our base case is still a pretty positive one.
Yeah, and I think by the way that the increase you're referring to probably relates to the deleveraging, which had been taking place, coming to a halt with the trade war with America, and then a return to stimulus, which led to more bridges and roads and structures, bringing more iron ore, increasing the price, and problems in Brazil raised the price. So we did well for that out of all that. The last question I'll ask before we turn to Q&A of people kindly giving up their lunch times to listen to this discussion is the leading business commentator, Alan Kohler, who was my first boss in Australia, wrote recently that for Australian businesses that have China as their plan A, they should start thinking about plan B. That seems to make sense to me, James. That doesn't, however, mean junking plan A. We're going to have to learn to live with China, but not to lean on it, maybe. But what do you think? People need to, boards and so on, need to think of a plan B as well.
Rowan, we're in agreement. So I'm not suggesting that businesses can be naive and put all their hopes on China. I mean, two things we say in the report is, let's be clear, a company that is highly leveraged to the Chinese market can't expect the government to bail them out. And indeed, as the government makes decisions to protect Australian sovereignty, some of those decisions are going to upset China, and Australian companies could find themselves in the firing line. Companies can't walk away from that. That's a genuine risk that they face. So it comes back to this question of what type of diversification strategy does it make sense for Australia to pursue? It's a China and one, which is what you're talking about, right? So it's not A or B, it's A and B. So sure, Australian companies should be looking to actively diversify. And I saw some comments, for example, from the CEO of Taylor Wines the other day in the Australian Financial Review. And he said he's well aware of the political risks involved in the China relationship. So he's looking at Singapore, Thailand, the United States and other markets as well. So there's your plan B. But what we have to do, Rowan, is get away from this silly and quite disastrous idea for our national interest that it's a China or diversification strategy. That's a recipe for less Australian income and less Australian jobs. That's a diversification strategy that I won't be signing up for.
Okay, thanks, James. And now we'll look at questions that you have thrown at us, particularly at James and Michael, the writer of the report. One of the questions we've come up is, what percentage of the $180 billion exports are not natural resources?
Yeah, great question. Now, that's going to be pushing me off the top of my head. But I think, so iron ore comes to about 80 billion. I think we do about 15 billion worth of LNG, 15 billion worth of coal. So I think we might be sitting around 50 or 60 billion. Now, so 1/3 might be non-resources and energy. That may seem small, but the point I would make there is that that's true for all of Australia's relationships, trading relationships. So if you look at our exports to Japan or India, for example, that chunk is going to be massive. And in fact, I'd encourage you to read the report, because this is exactly what we do. We look at the extent to which Australia's trade with China is diversified by product and compare it with our other trading relationships. And what we find is that it is more diversified than to Japan, and it's way more diversified than to India.
And another question, what does the Australia-China, what can the Australia-China business community do more to foster better understanding from both sides? How can we encourage more young Australians to become more interested in understanding China? Obviously, second language literacy has been a long-standing challenge, and
Rowan, on my screen, you've just frozen up. So I'm not sure if that's true for everyone.
I think we've lost Rowan temporarily. I might ask you a question, James, on behalf of Jane Golly.
Sure.
She said, the economists and business people hear you loud and clear, James, and you make perfect sense to most of us. But how do you go about changing the minds of those who don't like numbers, or those who have that strong national security view of the world? Are any of them listening today, I wonder?
Well, I don't know if they're listening, Jane, but look, one thing you don't do, this is one thing you don't do, and it's something I've learned in Australia-China relations, and frankly, I'm happy to say this, I think I've learned this from some of the previous mistakes I've made in the past. What you don't do is you don't not talk to each other. It's true to say that in the past, there has been two camps, and they've been throwing rubbish at each other, and often it's a generalization, it's a simplification, but you might have the economists and business and people on one side and the security folks on the other. So you want to be talking to those groups. So look, in my own job, I actively do my best to reach out to these folks. Now, sometimes I find they're willing to talk to me, sometimes they're not. Well, if they're not, I can't do much about that. But what I can do is listen to their arguments and acknowledge the genuine risks. So I hope anyone reading our report, for example, would see that I'm not saying that national security concerns are unfounded. Quite the opposite. I make it very, very clear. And I also make it very clear that the national interest and business interests are not the same thing. The national interest is a broader concept. So I think you acknowledge those concerns. I do think what is important, though, and if I could push my national security colleagues a bit, this would be the point that I think they have to deliver on. And I haven't seen them deliver on it yet. They're always talking about how we should reduce our dependence on China, but they don't say how we'll do it, right? For imports, for example, I remember an article from Chris Yeoman, who's the political commentator, and he said we should reduce our import dependence on China. Well, okay, Chris, but how are we going to do that? For example, are we going to put tariffs on Chinese imports? Are we going to get taxpayers to subsidize imports from other countries? Because until you actually propose specific policies, it becomes impossible to assess the costs and the benefits and compare those with the status quo. So look, I hope this report will encourage my colleagues who take a different view, maybe who come from more of a national security background, to provide some more meat to their arguments, rather than just sound bites that in the end are a bit simplistic.
Absolutely. I have another question here from Daniel Lee. He asks, we need to diversify with our trade partners. Aside from working with China, what other countries could we consider working with other than the US, Japan, and India? Would trading with UK be an option?
Well, this year the UK is going to go backwards. So, we're going to struggle to diversify to the European market, and that includes the UK. Look, one thing our report does is that we assess the drivers of trade. So there seems to be this idea in some parts of the commentariat that Canberra has these levers they can pull, ramp up the UK market, pull down the China one. In fact, trade is driven by some pretty basic drivers, economic complementarities across countries and differences in relative purchasing power. So the reality, whether you consider it unfortunate or not, is that the complementarities between the UK economy and the Australian economy are just not there to the same extent as the Chinese and the Australian economies are. What's been interesting to me as someone who studies this relationship full time over the last 5 years is that the complementarities between the Australian and Chinese economy have actually gotten bigger over the last 5 years. I mean, 10 years ago, we knew all about resources, but instead, what have we seen? Well, we've seen record sales of agricultural goods, services, tourism and education. So it's actually diversified to the extent that which the two economies are in fact complementary. So look, let's look at the UK, let's look at India, let's look at Indonesia, but I don't see us getting away from the fundamental position that China will occupy in Australia's trade.
Righty, there's another one here from Mitchell Eddy. Should we make a distinction between, we have Rowan back.
Sorry.
Welcome back, Rowan.
Rowan, I'll just ask this question and then I'll let you take over. From Mitchell Eddy, should we make a distinction between the individual risks taken by businesses and the systematic risk this creates as a whole? For example, individual rock lobster exporters decide to export to China. However, now 94% of rock lobsters go to China. This is not just a risk for the companies, it is a risk to the national economy. When there is a trade disruption, jobs are lost and companies want bailouts at a big cost to the government. Is there anything the government can or should do about this?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. It's a perfectly valid one. So one thing we say in the report is that those rock lobster farmers can't expect government bailouts because they've entered into they have allowed themselves to become highly leveraged to the Chinese market. So it's not really about bailouts, but the systemic risk question is an important one. And the Australian government does have some responsibilities here. And frankly, that's just not about whether the risk comes from China. That's about whether the risk comes from anywhere. Fortunately, the Australian economy has what we call automatic stabilisers built into it. When we see these shocks at a systemic level, we have a floating exchange rate, for example, which does a good job of buffering the Australian economy from shocks overseas. It's also important, obviously, for the Australian government to keep macroeconomic policy space. Monetary policy space is more or less run out unless you start pursuing some highly unconventional options. But, fiscal government spending space, that needs to be maintained. Obviously, the Australian government is in a much poorer situation now than it was a decade ago. But look, again, I just finished by observing that when we're talking about systemic shocks, they're real and the government does have a responsibility there, but they're not just coming from China. That's a much broader question.
So the last question is asking about, we've focused mainly on the Australian side of diversification. Are there any insights we can share about how China views the diversification issue? Because China itself is trading with everyone and going everywhere, isn't it, James?
Yeah, and I would say it's pretty alarmed by the international trading environment at the moment, Rowan, too. I mean, we worry about China perhaps hinting at economic retaliation directed at Australia. Well, it's not about standing up for China, but China has not had threats hinted at it from the United States. It's had threats delivered at it. The US government, we know, has blocked US companies from supplying Chinese companies in certain goods. So I think you're right. China is alive to this issue of diversification because it's at the coalface of these challenges, and I don't see that getting much better.
And China itself, of course, is accused of failing to abide by arrangements it signed up to, and so on. So it's both sides of these big powers can have criticisms thrown at them, can't they?
They can indeed, Rod. One important development I think we saw over the last week, and I don't think this has got enough coverage, is that you would have seen the Australian government has joined a group of like-minded countries to put in place a temporary substitute for the World Trade Organization's dispute resolution body, which of course the US blew up at the end of last year. Now, it's interesting when you run down the list of countries on that who've signed up to that. China is one of them. So this is, the US is not, by the way. So this is really important because I think sometimes these days we could read the newspapers and you'll get the opinion that Chinese interests and Australian interests are in fact opposites. Perhaps even that China's the enemy. Well, that's a very simplistic view, and it's certainly not in fact true. When it comes to issues around trade, for example, I think Australian interests and Chinese interests are actually more aligned there than, say, Australian interests and US interests.
Thanks, James. And I think, thank you for everyone for the questions you've asked, and it's been great. And we're looking forward very much to future webinars. And my final thoughts before passing over to you, James, our conversation today has underlined the depth of the challenge being thrown our way by the changed China that Xi Jinping has been driving. I think it's important to note that many of these questions are driven because China has changed. When liberal democracies last faced such a challenge, it came from a Soviet Union that it now appears clear was bankrupt in most categories except nuclear arms. Well, the PRC has already outlasted the USSR and despite its debt levels remains immensely powerful. Do we respond to the PRC's challenges? If so, how? Do we simply disconnect? Paul Kelly, the political analyst, not the singer, asked yesterday whether liberal economics and the notion of the national security state, underpinnings of the Liberal Party, might now be in conflict as a result of China's rise. Well, this ACRI report helpfully shows us just how hard disconnecting with China might be, even if the government, or Australia more broadly, should choose such a route. It's great, I will conclude, that we're getting to grips in an evidence-based way with this core issue of our time. So thank you very much, James and Michael, for your report. Over to you, James, and then Amy will conclude.
Thanks very much, Rowan. So let me finish with this thought. If you read the report, you will see it does not suggest in any way there's not real questions to be asked around the risks associated with Australia's international economic exposures. And some of those risks are heightened in the case of our economic engagement with China. So let's have the discussion. Let's have the discussion. But what is critical, and what I'm not so optimistic we're seeing at the moment, is that discussion proceeding based on facts and evidence. Let's hear detailed proposals so we can weigh up the costs and benefits and compare with the status quo now. So I think I'll finish on that point.
Thank you, James and Rowan. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it, and we can make future UTS ACRI events a better experience for everyone involved. If you wanted to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australiaChinaRelations.org. The report discussed today is also available there. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news at ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to our speakers James Lawrenson and Rowan Callick, and all of our attendees. Goodbye.